Hello everyone, this is part 15 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto sprinted across the ground at Kimimaro, but before he completely closed his distance, he unsealed a kunai and threw it straight at the man. As predicted, he simply caught the kunai in mid-flight and looked about ready to throw it straight back when Naruto disappeared from view. Thanks for holding on to that. Kimimaro felt the kunai taken from his grasp as Naruto twisted his body into an awkward shape to deliver the fastest and most lethal kick he knew to the back of his head. What he wasn't expecting was for two long bones to suddenly rip themselves out of Kimimaro's back and cross over the back of his head, stopping Naruto's foot from landing. In his shock, he didn't properly react when Kimimaro countered by spinning furiously and elbowing Naruto in the chest. He was launched back by the surprising power of the blow, obviously supplemented as Naruto watched the man's elbow receded back through his skin. The terminally ill man was given no respite as sand shot up from the ground all around him, trying to capture the man and crush him to death. Kimimaro skillfully jumped and arced his body through the air away from the sand to land back on his feet with the grace of a ballet dancer. Dance of the Camellia. Even in a fight, Kimimaro's voice was emotionless and blunt, although his unusual style of fighting captivated both Gaara and Naruto. They watched in fascination as the man's own arm bone slid out of his wrist, turning into the perfect sword, lightweight and tough. Gaara didn't stay distracted long, quickly sending out tendrils of his sand to either ensnare or crush the agile Kekkei Genkai possessor. Naruto couldn't get close enough to attack while Gaara was using his sands like this, so he retreated a fair distance to give the two opponents room to maneuver. It really was a sight to see. Kimimaro would bend his body to escape Gaara's sand, and in all honesty, Naruto had to admit the man made it look like a dance. The tendrils and arms he couldn't dodge were sliced clean through by the surprisingly sharp bone blade. The two seemed to be at a stalemate and both realized it, Gaara quickly withdrawing his sand while Kimimaro jumped backwards impassively. Naruto, I need time to prepare, keep him busy. The blonde grumbled a little, staring across at the very adept combatant who was returning his sword to its rightful place in his arm. Easier said than done. Gaara just shot him a glare and Naruto let of a few choice mumbles again before deciding against taijutsu this time. His foot was sore thinking about hitting those bones again. He formed his hand into a familiar seal and immediately 5 of him appeared out of thin air, each drawing a kunai and channeling wind chakra into the blade. Instantly the kunai in his clone's hands were sharper and more durable, perfect for what he had in mind. They all took off straight at Kimimaro, who stayed perfectly still, collecting himself for fighting multiple enemies. Dance of the Willow. All over his body long white bones protruded in vicious spikes that ended in deadly points. As the clones approached, with Naruto staying back to observe and possible support, they split up. 2 went in one direction whilst 2 went the other, circling the bone wielder as the last clone jumped high into the air using its fellow clone as a springboard. Kimimaro just moved down into a well-practiced crouching stance, allowing the sun to shine on his bony protrusions. The 4 on the ground attacked simultaneously, all lashing out at the same time with their wind-enhanced kunai. The maneuver forced Kimimaro to produce more bones from his body from much more awkward places. The clone in the air came down clutching a Rasengan, only for Kimimaro to dodge out of the way at the last minute and send a kick to the clone's unprotected stomach, dispersing it. Naruto grimaced as the clone's memories returned to him and he rubbed his stomach painfully. That was a strong kick. The other 4 continued to battle Kimimaro at close distance, keeping him occupied if not winning the fight itself, as Gaara seemed to gather his energy for something. Kimimaro grabbed one of the clones by the leg when it overextended a kick and used its momentum to send it hurtling into another NE, dispersing both in a puff of smoke. The remaining clones looked to Gaara nervously but held the ground against the very skilled Sound Nin. One of them got a lucky blow in and sliced one of Kimimaro's protrusions clean off. His celebration was cut short when the man simply grew it back, bones magically appearing out of nothing as the spike was restored. Kimimaro took the clone's slightly shocked hesitancy as a moment to deliver a vicious kick, enough to destroy the clone, earning another wince from the real Naruto. The final clone just looked at Kimimaro with but anxiety and curiosity. How are you doing that? The older shinobi narrowed his eyes at the boy, looking for some kind of deception, Finding nothing but genuine curiosity, the man sighed, which in turn elicited a round of coughing that didn't sound healthy at all. Naruto suddenly remembered Sakin talking about an illness and he wondered if this was it. I have the rare bloodline trait of the Kaguya clan. It allows me to directly and sometimes indirectly control my osteoblast and osteoclast cells to grow and reshape my bones on a whim. Kimimaro punctuated this sentence by sending out his finger bones like tiny pullets, riddling the last clone with them as it finally dispersed out of existence. Naruto took a moment to get over the phantom pain of essentially being shot before he stood up tall. Why would you fight for someone like Orochimaru? Kimimaro narrowed his eyes and Naruto immediately regretted bringing it up. I fight for Lord Orochimaru because he saved me. My clan were warlike and barbaric, fighting everything with a pulse because they refused to move out of the era of barbarians and into the era of shinobi. As such, they were cut down where they stood, and I would have joined them were it not for my abilities and Lord Orochimaru. He saved me, gave my life purpose and meaning. He finished the speech with another bout of coughs, this time louder and worse than the last. I have failed my master too many times. I could not strike down the Kazekage like he asked of me. Naruto's eyes widened while Gaara's narrowed dangerously, whatever he was doing speeding up. Then this illness prevented me from becoming his host. I cannot fail him again, so I must bring back the vessel so my life can have meaning again. All through the speech, Kimimaro had been advancing on Naruto, who had concurrently backed off, not quite knowing how to combat the bone manipulator without using the Kyuubi's chakra, which he didn't want to do for risk of losing control again. Luckily, Gaara finally relaxed as he finished, bringing his arms up in one fluid motion as the world suddenly heaved. Both Naruto and Kimimaro were thrown about on their feet as a desert's worth of sand blasted from the ground, sweeping up into the air before condensing and slamming towards Kimimaro's unbalanced form. Imperial Sand Burial. The mass of sand crashed into the last Kaguya's body, crushing him against the ground as the sand dug deep with its roots while the upper half formed an enormous pyramid. Finally, all the hardest elements in the ground sheathed the pyramid like a coating. That sand would now be impervious to almost any attack. They waited with bated breath for a few seconds, but when nothing emerged, they released the breath they had both been subconsciously holding. Naruto sighed in relief and smiled at Gaara wearily, worn out from the fighting and running. His smile turning into a snarl as he remembered the reason they came here in the first place. He took off across the field, having to navigate the pyramid. He rounded the massive corner to see the two caskets billowing smoke now. He ran over, soon followed by Gaara, but fell to the ground as the petal mark on his wrist suddenly flared again and pain washed over his body. He struggled to his feet only to see the two caskets practically explode outwards, releasing one last cloud of smoke which hid the two shinobi inside from view. Somebody suddenly dashed out of the cloud in the opposite direction, and Naruto knew it was Sasuke. He wouldn't have cared less about him right now, but he was technically part of the objective, so he waved his hand at Gaara, who nodded and pursued the target quickly. Naruto stumbled over to the other cloud of smoke, watching it slowly clear away, letting him first see a silhouette, then red hair. He smiled and increased his pace, ignoring the dull throb from his wrist as he did so. He sprinted across to Tayuya's kneeling form only to start when he got nearer. The last of the smoke cleared and he could finally see Tayuya, or at least who he assumed was Tayuya. She had undergone some changes. It was still her, at least that much was obvious, as she was wearing the clothes he had last seen her in. Except, from what parts of her skin he could see, she looked a lot darker now, beyond tanned. Her hair had also changed, lengthening and turning more a shade of pink than red. Of course, the most noticeable thing he could see from this angle were the large white horns protruding from her head, which weren't unlike the bone spikes Kimimaro had used himself. Tayuya was currently staring down at her hands, her back facing away from Naruto. When she heard him step closer, she flinched, huddling in closer on herself and seeming to shrink, very unlike Tayuya's personality. Go away, shithead, don't look at me. Naruto frowned but kept walking closer. In response, Tayuya stood and tried to run away from him. Unfortunately, her center of balance had shifted, and even in his weakened state, Naruto was faster. He caught up and gripped her wrist, tugging at it so she spun around to face him. He grabbed her other wrist when she did so, staring at her new face for the first time. Like he had thought, her skin had darkened, making her look like she could be from Kumogakure. However, it was her eyes that captivated him, gaining black markings around the outside with small points emerging from the bottom of each eye. Her eyes themselves had gained black sclera while the irises had turned the most brilliant gold. He wouldn't say the last part out loud, but he also thought she had become slightly curvier in this state. Tayuya tried to turn her head away, not wanting Naruto to see her like this. Please shithead, turn away, I look like a monster. Naruto scowled, but it wasn't aimed at Tayuya. With an absent thought he dismissed his genjutsu and the transformation underneath it. He released his natural form to the world, ears, tails and all, and forced Tayuya to look at him by cupping her chin. Tayuya, you aren't a monster. Tayuya saw he had changed and frowned at him, momentarily overcoming her own insecurities out of concern. Shithead, what if somebody sees YMM? Naruto quickly silenced her by pressing his lips against hers, making her golden eyes widen in surprise before they fluttered closed. Naruto kept his open, watching with a pleased grin as Tayuya's altered features receded before the flame markings on her body did the same. The curse mark on her shoulder pulsed angrily at being denied, but quickly the protection seal reformed around it, cutting off its influence. Naruto sighed in relief before realizing Tayuya was still kissing him. He remembered what happened last time he broke a kiss first and decided against it. He put his hands on her waist while she in turn pulled hers around his neck, both acting on pure instinct. Naruto remembered something he had read in the appropriately named Makeout Paradise, and prodded his tongue against Tayuya's lips, eliciting a small yelp of surprise from the girl. Even through the shock she recognized what was happening and hesitantly opened her mouth to allow him entry. Naruto slowly moved into the girl's mouth, meeting her own tongue as both teens opened their eyes wide at the strange sensation. Neither of them found it uncomfortable or unpleasant, so quickly the two writhing muscles were fighting for dominance between Naruto and Tayuya. Surprisingly, Naruto won and he claimed Tayuya's mouth before finally they both broke away from one another, panting heavily with a thin stream of saliva connecting them at the mouth. They both stared at each other, red tinging both their cheeks as blue eyes stared into green. The intimate contact finally broke when they heard a forced cough behind them, forcing to look around and see Gaara, staring at them oddly while a large man-sized ball of sand floated behind him. Both teens immediately shied away from one another, blushing furiously but doing their best not to let Gaara see it. Gaara smirked knowingly before he quickly saw a problem with the situation. Naruto, your tails. Naruto looked around, his blush replaced with confusion. Huh, what about them? Gaara just sighed and put a hand to his forehead as Naruto realized what he meant. He chuckled sheepishly while scratching the back of his head. It didn't take him long to replace the transformation followed by the genjutsu which Tayuya reluctantly helped him strengthen. Finished, it was Naruto's turn to stare as he looked at the large ball of sand hovering a few feet above the ground. He could hear a few muffled noises coming from inside, some sounding more profane than others, and was about to ask about it when Chidori, a hand burst through the tough sand wall, but only a hand. Naruto immediately noticed that it was a mottled gray color with sharpened white fingernails like miniature claws. Gaara just twitched the corner of his mouth in annoyance before he made a flicking gesture with his fingers. The sand around the protruding arm tightened uncomfortably and then shifted until everybody heard a sickening crack letting them know the arm was broken. Gaara finally let up on the painful torture and the strange arm slithered back inside the sphere while Gaara proceeded to close up the small hole that remained behind. Naruto raised an eyebrow at the whole affair but said nothing, feeling the Uchiha got exactly what he deserved if he had anything to do with Tayuya's kidnapping. The three Sunanin and their captive started moving out of the clearing until Tayuya finally noticed the proverbial elephant in the room. Whoa, what's with the fucking pyramid? They retraced their path through the forest until they came across an area practically covered in strange yellow kunai along with dead spiders that the motionless body of Kidomaru. It didn't take much looking around to find Neji being tended to by Lee with his somewhat limited first aid knowledge. Upon seeing how injured the Hyuga was, Naruto felt a pang of guilt at leaving him behind like he had. He steeled himself though, he knew what he was doing when he volunteered, plus the objective was ultimately fulfilled. All they could hope now was that he could get some proper help back at the village or earlier if they were lucky and the medic shinobi were already on their way. Naruto helped Lee carry Neji as delicately as they could, which proved to be difficult considering the slightest nudges would earn groans of pain from the unconscious Byakugan wielder. They all moved past where Lee had fought Jirobo, all of them marveling at the incredible crater in the makeshift clearing. It made them look twice at Lee, wondering what he had done exactly, but soon the monotony of slow travel returned the group to their own quiet reflection. Sasuke wouldn't stop moaning from inside his temporary prison even though every time he did Gaara would constrict the sphere just a little. They all breathed a small sigh of relief when they all heard the noises and moaning stop, assuming the Uchiha had fallen unconscious from lack of oxygen. Gaara added a few air holes to the sphere and they continued walking. Lee and Naruto could have cried out in joy when they finally reached the area where Kiba fought Hibiki to see various Anbu and medic nin swarming the place. The group was immediately spotted and Neji was carried away on a stretcher to be properly treated. Anbu agents quickly surrounded them, noting the sand sphere and their appearance. Was the mission successful? It was a bird-masked Anbu who asked and Naruto quickly nodded while Gaara dumped Sasuke onto the ground. Everybody noticed that his seal had returned to normal, at least indicating that he was in fact unconscious. The Anbu nodded his approval before motioning for one of the other agents. The latest Anbu walked over and performed a few hand seals, startling everybody as wood erupted from the ground and promptly wrapped Sasuke up. What's going to happen to him now? The first Anbu turned to Naruto, looking at him in obvious curiosity despite the mask concealing his features. He simply looked at Sasuke being hauled onto a different operative's shoulder and back at Naruto before walking off. He obviously didn't feel obligated to answer any questions unless they were important to their own mission. Naruto just sighed. That kind of reaction couldn't have meant anything good, but he smiled safe in the knowledge that he got Tayuya back. The four still conscious ninja ducked into a nearby medical tent that had been set up, walking over to where Kiba lay stretched out on a portable stretcher. There was a doctor hovering around, checking a chart every so often. He looked at them curiously before his gaze flickered between them and Kiba. Oh, there's nothing to worry about, merely a mild case of aggravated chakra exhaustion. Naruto and Lee furrowed their brows at this. They had never heard of that condition. What do you mean aggravated? The doctor just chuckled. Don't worry, the word makes it sound worse than it is. It just happens after people like the Inuzuka take a soldier pill and use all of their chakra up. Really, there's nothing to worry about. I'm sure a boy like him has gone through it a few times in their training. The four ninja nodded, but right now they were all staring at the other beds set up around the tent, longingly staring at them. Each was tired in their own right and right now sleep seemed like the best possible option. Unfortunately, that was also denied to them as another Anbu operative lifted the tent flap. You four need to deliver your report to the Hokage as soon as possible. The exhausted shinobi just nodded wearily before following the masked ninja out of the medical tent. Most of them looked like they barely want to walk, let alone run, but they were used to pushing their bodies to the limit and were soon hopping through the trees in the direction of the village. And once Gaara disabled Sasuke, we returned through the areas we fought the enemy in, picking up our teammates before arriving at the medics and Anbu. One of the Anbu used wood. Tsunade waved him off with her hand, looking slightly tired herself, although Naruto couldn't blame her considering it was about 3 in the morning. Yes, I know the details after that. She sighed deeply, wishing she had some sake with her right now to calm her nerves. She leaned back in her large chair and turned her head slightly to look out the large panoramic window that had a view of the entire village. Alright, well, mission success. You'll all want to go get some sleep, I guess. Dismissed. The assembled Chunin all nodded their thanks before retiring from the room. Lee bid them good night as they exited the Hokage tower before sprinting off in the direction of the training grounds, making the other three wonder where he got the energy. The Suna Chunin made their way towards Anko's apartment complex in a more peaceful manner, slowly walking there in silence. It was more peaceful than awkward, all of them too tired to try and strike up a conversation. They made it back in short time and quietly snuck in so they wouldn't wake Anko if she was in. Gaara wished them a good night with a yawn before they all went to their respective rooms. Tayuya was about to get into bed before Naruto put a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him curiously, wondering what he wanted considering they were both shattered. Tayuya, I know you're tired, but do you think we could? He smiled weakly. Do that again. He motioned with his eyes until Tayuya got the picture, making her blush a little, but she nodded slowly, her own smile on her face. She had to muffle the squeak of surprise when a happy and suddenly energetic Naruto tackled her onto the soft bed, already pressing his lips against her, waiting for her to return the gesture, which she gladly did. Neither of them noticed the small video camera in the corner of the room with a small red light blinking occasionally. In her room, Anko watched the monitor with a broad but slightly perverted smile. Am I a genius or am I a genius? I can't wait to show Hannah. When Tayuya, Gaara, and Naruto walked into the Hokage's office, it looked like Tsunade hadn't moved at all since last night, and strangely the stack of paperwork seemed even larger. Right now she was peacefully dozing with her head on the desk, a small strand of drool leaking out the corner of her mouth to slowly pull atop some document or another. Naruto leaned a bit closer to Tayuya and whispered out the corner of his mouth. Why doesn't she just use clones to do the paperwork? Tayuya just shrugged and whispered back. She's the Hokage, I'm sure she'll figure it out eventually. Naruto just shrugged and nodded. Hell, if he could work it out then soon it should be able to. Finally the woman seemed to stir at their whisperings, bringing her head off the table, bringing a sheet of paper with her as it stuck to her face. That earned a small round of snickers from the Chunin before Tsunade's eyes focused and they became more serious. What? You three are back already? You can't possibly want another mission so soon. Naruto shook his head uncertainly. He wasn't sure how to go about saying this. Actually the repairs to Konoha are finished. We thought it was probably best if we went back to Suna now. That seemed to wake Tsunade right up as she sat bolt upright in her chair. After everything that had happened, it had nearly slipped her mind that these three weren't in fact Leaf Shinobi. That should have been fairly obvious from Gaara's forehead protector, but Tsunade had a tendency to overlook what she wanted to avoid, debt collectors and paperwork for instance. Oh, that's right. Well, I suppose your service to Konoha has ended. She seemed troubled by this, especially by Naruto leaving. He was the reason she became Hokage in the first place. In her mind she had imagined someday handing him the hat and robes while she looked on in pride. That image slowly crumbled in front of her as a harsh reality hit home. Naruto seemed to notice this and tried to cheer the woman up a little. Hey, don't worry about it, you know we'll come visit. He grinned broadly and Tsunade couldn't help but join him. Well, if that's everything. She trailed off, really hoping that one of the three would correct her, tell her there was something else they needed, but sadly they all just gave a curt nod. Tsunade sighed, turning on the swivel chair to stand up and walk over to the three. Okay then, gather the supplies you need and you can fill out the appropriate paperwork with Izumo and Kotetsu at the gate. She paused, the smallest smirks appearing on her face before she wrapped all three of them in a death hug that was actually enough cause for concern that Gaara's sand defense sprang up, pushing Tsunade back while he panted for air. Stay out of trouble. She received some hasty nods so she wouldn't attempt another hug. Tsunade turned to Tayuya next and smiled knowingly as she glanced between her and Naruto. Anko was rather indiscriminate when it came to gossip. Keep him out of trouble, Tayuya. The redhead nodded slowly, wondering why she was singled out, but soon they were on their way out of the office and back into the streets. They spent the rest of their time saying the goodbyes to the people they had met and come to be friendly with, even visiting Kiba and Neji in the hospital despite Naruto's hatred for the establishments. They all swung by the Inuzuka compound and bid farewell to Chum and Hana, both of whom seemed genuinely sad the trio were leaving. Finally they made it to the gate where they saw Anko waiting for them, obviously taking the free time to scare the daylights out of Izumo and Kotetsu if their faces were anything to go on. They approached and Anko spotted to them, waving in an overly enthusiastic manner that made the gate guard sweat drop in embarrassment. When they had first told the purple-haired Kunoiki they were leaving, she had pouted and complained saying they were just starting to have fun, but eventually she came around after a not-so-small bribe of dango. Hey Gaki, I guess I'll be seeing you then. The three nodded a little sadly. Anko may have been crazy and a complete slave driver, but she and Hana were fun to be around. She just shrugged, flicking a dango stick out of nowhere and picking her teeth with it. Naruto smirked at the action. It was just everything that embodied Anko. At least when I next see you will be able to beat you, Anko-sensei. The taller woman just laughed and ruffled Naruto's spiky hair much to his annoyance. Yeah, sure you will, Gaki, and Jiraiya will stop being a pervert. She said it jovially, but in her mind she already knew that if he used his Hiraishin on her then he would probably be able to beat her as they were now. Of course he didn't need to know that little tidbit of information, so Anko kept her lips sealed. Widening her eyes like she forgot something, she smirked and pulled out a camera while the Chunin looked at her curiously. Anko-sensei, what's that for? She just chuckled and tossed the camera to Izumo, who looked at it blankly. You guys were my first team, so I wanted a photo of us all. Naruto looked around the gates. Shouldn't Hana be here as well then? Anko pouted with her arms crossed under her chest in a way that would hypnotize most men. Oh please, I was the real sensei. She was just the helper. Naruto smiled as Anko walked right into his trap. Oh, is that right, Anko? The aforementioned kunoichi turned around very slowly to see Hana behind her with a swirling vortex of darkness around her looking positively murderous. What? No. Of course not. You know me, Hana, just joking. She said it with a smile, but everybody noticed the bead of sweat roll down her cheek. Of course Naruto, Izumo, and Kotetsu were the only ones who followed it down further. Anko decided to divert the attention off of her. Well anyway, now that we're all here we can really take the photo. She laughed nervously while Hana calmed down, and soon they were all grouped together with the two sensei at the back and the Chunin at the front with Naruto in the middle. Hana and Anko had to leave after that, but not before the three of them got their copies of the photo, each carefully putting it in their packs. They signed the correct paperwork that allowed them to leave He Village, and soon they were on the road out of Konoha. It felt good for all three of them to finally go home after so long away. Normally it would take a shinobi 3 days to reach Sunagakure from Konoha, but the trio were in no rush and made it in just fewer than 4, which was still decent. The endless deserts were a comforting sight for them all as they approached the massive entrance to the village. The guards only briefly looked over their paperwork, everybody recognized them by now. They all seemed to be acting strangely around Gaara though, well stranger than normal. Surprisingly, the first person they saw when they walked through the village gates was Baki, and they all smiled happily while Naruto rushed forward. Baki-sensei. The grizzled veteran smiled pleasantly at his students after not seeing them for such a length of time. Hey, I bet the village has been pretty quiet without us around. He said it jokingly, but Baki actually nodded his head, looking dreamily off into the distance while Naruto developed a small tick over his eye. Hey, that's not funny, sensei. The older man begged to differ and chuckled to prove it, although the laughter died down when Baki addressed Gaara. Gaara, there is something we must discuss, but I felt it would be better if we went to the council. Naruto stopped paying attention, turning around to see two more familiar faces approaching. He waved over to Kankuro and Temari, and while the other blonde waved back, the puppeteer in training jogged over to his brother, interrupting his conversation with Baki. Hey little bro, or should I say Kazekage same. Tayuya, Naruto, and Gaara all widened their eyes considerably while the former two stared at the Ichibi container with shock. What? Naruto and Tayuya stood, or rather sat, outside of the council chambers in heated expectation. If it wasn't for the privacy seal placed on the room, they would have been both pressed right up against the door for anything they might hear regarding their friend. The news had hit them all unexpectedly, and at first Naruto had thought Kankuro had been joking. It turned out he wasn't. The council were explaining the situation to Gaara, and the two outside couldn't wait to hear what was going on. If it was all true, then Gaara would become the youngest Kazekage and youngest Kage ever. It was an amazing achievement. Naruto knew he deserved it. Nobody loved the Sand Village like his friend did, and he would probably protect it with his life. He also knew that Gaara had the potential to become one of the greatest shinobi of their time. His control with sand was increasing every day, and he was just beginning to properly learn magnet release like his father and the third Kazekage before him. Finally, a slightly paler than usual Gaara exited the chamber, turning to his friends with an obviously startled expression. They stood up from where they had been sat against the walls of the corridor and walked over. Gaara seemed a little shell-shocked by the experience. He had aimed for Kazekage for a while now, but he hadn't expected it so soon, and not because of the death of his father. So what did they say? It was Naruto who spoke, placing a hand on his shocked friend's shoulder. We should talk in my office. Even Gaara sounded incredulous when he said it, not quite believing his own words were true and this wasn't all a dream. They walked through the halls of the Kazekage Tower, and out of respect for Gaara stayed quiet until they reached his new office. Gaara walked in first and quickly moved across the room to sit at the large desk that took up most of that side of the room. He sat down, looking a little swamped in the large chair, like a child wearing their father's clothing, which, when he put on the Kazekage robes, he would be. This is awesome, Gaara. You're Kazekage now. His friend just nodded mutely, staring into the desk and the small pile of paperwork that sat to the side. So what's your first decree going to be? Gaara smirked a little at Tayuya's joke, but silence still hung heavy in the room. Come on, Gaara, you have to talk eventually. Gaara finally looked up, looking at his two closest and oldest friends who were sitting in the chairs across from him. I don't deserve it. Both his friends just looked at the redhead in shock, not quite believing what they were hearing. What do you mean, Gaara? You have to be joking, right? Naruto stood up from his chair and slammed his hands down on the desk with quite a bit of force. Nobody but you deserves this. Gaara looked at his friend with a bit of shock for the outburst but still didn't look any more convinced. Gaara, you would protect this village with your life, wouldn't you? He nodded slowly. Despite the fact they made you suffer by placing a biju in you without your permission. Again another nod came from the young Kage. Then you're fucking perfect for the job. Naruto seemed a little annoyed Tayuya had cut in on his rant, but he nodded enthusiastically anyway because it was essential, the point he was trying to drive home. Come on Gaara, you're level-headed, you're strong, and you control sand for Kami's sake. Something you have no shortage of here. Who's better for becoming Kazekage of the village hidden in the sand? Naruto narrowed his eyes when it looked like Gaara was about to try and reply. You'll have the council for support and advice, and you know we'll always be here to help you out. Naruto smiled a little at that. You'll do an amazing job Gaara, trust us. Tayuya nodded along with the sentiment. Gaara sat back in the chair, his hair falling away from his eyes to show him looking incredibly thoughtful. He looked nervous, but at least now he was thinking about this properly without as many doubts. Thank you Naruto, Tayuya. He leaned back forward on his chair, his hands forming a steeple on the desk in front of him as he stared at the wood. I need some time to think about this. Naruto and Tayuya both nodded curtly before standing up and walking towards the door. Before he left though, Naruto had one last thing to say. Gaara, if you did this, it wouldn't just be for Suna, it would be for every Jinchuriki out there. You could show them that there is hope, that they can be loved and respected as well. Gaara seemed a little taken by the heartfelt statement before Naruto followed Tayuya out of the door, leaving the Kazekage to be alone to think. He sighed as he leaned back on the chair, turning as he did so to look out over the village through the window. All those lives going about the daily business, civilian, shinobi and kunoichi alike, they would all be under his protection, his guidance. It was such an enormous burden to bear for once a young, and Gaara could feel that pressing down on his shoulders. But then he wouldn't have to bear it alone, he would have his friends, he would have the council, and he would have Baki and his siblings. The knot in his chest seemed to loosen a bit as he stood up and looked out of the window at the village, his village. Both Tayuya and Naruto were worried for their friend. Despite their encouraging words and help, they knew that accepting the job would be a burden. It was a burden they all were fully prepared to shoulder together. They would never abandon their friend like that. Even so, they couldn't help smile. Gaara would become famous as the youngest Kage ever, the manipulator of deserts. They walked through the village just contemplating that, taking in the sights they had missed these last few months. Nothing had really changed in the sand village. People still went about their lives, shinobi still trained, and shopkeepers still flogged their food and wares. It was all so familiar to them now, and it was comforting at the same time. Tayuya had never truly called any place her home, but the sand village certainly came close. It was filled with the people she cared about, and, looking at Naruto, it was filled with people who cared about her. The redhead quickly grew a smirk as she looked at her boyfriend, too lost in his thoughts to notice. Come on, let's hit the training grounds. Naruto looked around, snapped out of his thoughts quite suddenly. What? Already? We only just got back. Tayuya's smirk grew and she started to pull on Naruto's arm in the direction of their favorite training ground. Huh. I don't think I've ever seen you refuse a chance to train, shithead. Naruto just smiled sheepishly. That was actually probably true, except after the third's death. Anyway, you know I want to come up with a counter for your Haraishin. Naruto laughed at that. Ever since he had completed his technique, Tayuya had been racking her brain to come up with an effective counter. He wasn't sure why she thought she could. If the entire nation of Iwagakure couldn't, then she had little chance. Even so, he had explained everything of how the technique worked and answered her every question. It was a win-win for Naruto either way. He either found there was no counter for his technique, which was good for him, or he learned what the counter was and could prepare for it if it was ever used against him. So far Tayuya hadn't found anything. There was of course the fact that it actually required the kunai and seals to be placed somewhere, but Naruto could travel to a moving kunai and he always had spares in his seals. It always surprised his opponent when he did that, throwing a kunai behind him only to appear just as it was going past them. He had heard that the fourth did something similar during the Third Shinobi War. As much as Naruto idolized and respected the man, he didn't want to merely copy the technique, he wanted some way of improving it. He needed something that made it unique as opposed to just a copy of a legendary jutsu. Hey, you know I never named the technique. Tayuya stopped pulling at his arm and looked at him strangely. What are you talking about? It's called the Haraishin, right? Naruto shook his head, his mouth shifting to one side as he gave it some thought. Well, technically it isn't the Haraishin, it might do the same thing but it isn't the same technique. Tayuya's face smirked as she realized Naruto was right before her eyes lit up. Are you kidding me? We get to name a brand new technique. That's fucking awesome. Naruto smiled and nodded as the two returned to walking towards the training ground, now both in deep thought. How about the Reijin no Sutepu? Naruto considered the name but found that step didn't quite accurately portray what he was doing and shook his head. How about Kuken Tenso? Tayuya thought about the name. It definitely sounded cool but Naruto could only transport himself and things he carried with it so it still didn't seem right. Sukurura Hoppu Oshiru. Naruto chuckled. It's a little bit of a tongue twister, don't you think? Tayuya frowned but nodded anyway, going back to her thoughts. A large smile grew across Naruto's face as the perfect name suddenly came to mind and he nudged Tayuya so she would look at him. What about the Fujin no Ikki? Tayuya thought about it and her own smile grew across her features. Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome. Wind God's Breath. It's got a nice ring to it and it kind of emulates the Haraishin's name. Naruto nodded, happy that Tayuya agreed with him. She was a little downhearted because she hadn't been the one to think of it but happy that Naruto's technique was now truly his own. We'll tell Gaara when he has some time, see what he thinks of it. He looked around to try and see where they were. The two had been so in thought they hadn't noticed where they were going. To his surprise they had actually reached the training ground without noticing. He smiled warmly at the sight. The training ground was near a large pillar of rock that jutted out of the desert like, as Tayuya liked to put it, a massive middle finger to Kami. Off to one side there was a peaceful and perfectly clear oasis surrounded by some thick grass and shrubberies as well as a few palm trees. It was like a small tropical island, just without the ocean surrounding it. Naruto grinned and unsealed one of his special kunai, throwing over to Tayuya who caught it on reflex. Hold this for a second. Before we train I just want to test a theory I had. Tayuya nodded and seemed interested. Usually when Naruto had a theory, something ended up getting blown up. She grimaced as she remembered Naruto first experimenting with transporting things other than himself with the Fujin no Ikki. The poor cat would never be the same. She watched as Naruto ran at the small oasis, thinking he was just going to run on its surface. She surprised him when he simply dived straight into the water, not even bothering to remove his clothes. He re-emerged from the cold waters with a laugh, looking at Tayuya's confused face with a knowing smirk. Just hold on to that kunai, okay? Tayuya just frowned and nodded. She was doing it, wasn't she? Suddenly Tayuya felt strange, like electricity was traveling across her skin. She nearly dropped the kunai from shock, but before she could her vision went fuzzy and she was instantly drenched. Anybody watching her would have seen her simply disappear from her position on the side of the oasis and suddenly reappear underwater. Tayuya's eyes went wide as she nearly breathed in water, thrashing around in shock and panic until a strong hand found her own and pulled her to the surface. Naruto watched in worry as Tayuya coughed loudly on the bank of the small pond, retching up the water she had accidentally inhaled. He had meant it as a joke, he didn't mean for her to nearly drown. Truly he had simply wanted to see if he could make the connection with the seal's two-way and transport things marked with the seal to him. He guessed on that account it was a success, but he made a note not to try it around water until he got a few bugs tweaked. What the fucking hell? Tayuya had to stop to cough up more water. Was that? Naruto only looked away apologetically, rubbing the back of his head embarrassedly. Sorry, I didn't expect you to appear underwater. Tayuya scowled at him, having already worked out that she had just traveled via the Fujin no Ikki somehow only to end up under the water. Did you just test out something experimental on me? Naruto's eyes opened wide and he waved out his arms in front of him in a manner he hoped were placating. What? No. I've done it before and it's perfectly safe, I promise. It was just supposed to be a joke. Tayuya would have hit him but she was too busy coughing up her lungs on the bank. Naruto stood over her, slowly dripping onto the sand beneath him as he waited for her to finish. Finally the worst seemed behind her and she stood up a little shakily, looking down at herself in annoyance. Great, now my fucking clothes are soaked. Naruto, hoping to make it up to her, smiled brightly and grabbed the kunai out of her hand, throwing it away from him so it hit the large pillar of rock. He rushed towards Tayuya who didn't have time to react before Naruto scooped her up in his arms. Hey shithead, what the fuck are you? As she spoke she felt that familiar prickling across her skin. Doing. Tayuya opened her eyes after clamping them closed, not wanting another of Naruto's pranks. He carefully set her down and she realized that he had moved him to his kunai at the pillar. What the fuck was that for, you moron? Naruto just rubbed the back of his head and pointed at Tayuya's stomach. At least that was what she thought he was pointing at. She looked down, worrying that he might have left a part of her behind or something like that, only to see everything was normal. She moved to punch him for being an idiot but realized when she moved her arm that her clothes weren't clinging to her. She looked down again and realized her clothes were now perfectly dry, her hair was still somewhat damp but it was better than being drenched. She looked at Naruto, who had looked away, his eyes closed in expectance of the punch that didn't come. How did you do that? He cracked his eyes open and smiled once he saw Tayuya wasn't beating the crap out of him. I have to focus on what I bring through the seal with me. I just left the water behind when we moved. Sure enough, Tayuya looked over to where they had been and saw two rather large puddles slowly soaking into the sand. Wow, I didn't realize you could pick and choose what you brought through with you. Naruto chuckled nervously and returned to rubbing his head. Yeah, neither did I. Tayuya chuckled before she realized what he had just said. Stop experimenting on me. For emphasis, she threw in a punch to the head to punctuate each word. A very dazed and slightly scared Naruto just nodded hurriedly. He didn't think it would help right now if he added in he had technically experimented on himself as well. Tayuya huffed and crossed her arms under her chest, suddenly having lost interest in training. She smirked and eyes Naruto's still sheepish expression. So what are you going to do to make it up to me, Naruto? Naruto recognized the tone in her voice. She had used it a few times on their journey from Konoha. Tayuya's eyes went wide as Naruto practically pounced on her, bringing his arms around her back to support her as he pressed his lips against her heatedly. After a moment of shock at the speed of it all, Tayuya relaxed and leaned into the kiss herself. She questioningly licked along Naruto's upper lip, to which he immediately allowed her entry, letting their tongues battle it out as their breathing became more ragged. Tayuya felt her legs weaken and soon she was only staying up because of the support Naruto provided. She moaned into the kiss, making Naruto smile before his hand started to travel down from her back. He placed one hand on her ass, which was quickly followed by the other, and he used that as leverage to lift Tayuya up. She wrapped her legs around his waist, content to let him carry her as they continued their hungry kiss. It was enough to say that the both of them had quickly found out they greatly enjoyed kissing one another and made it the goal to do it as much as possible. Tayuya momentarily broke for air, but she leapt right back in as soon as both took a good breath. One of Naruto's hands broke away from its place on her soft cheek and started rubbing her back slowly, eliciting another moan from the excited redhead. Eventually the two tired each other out and sat back against the pillar next to one another, panting after their small tongue war. Tayuya leaned in closer, placing her head on Naruto's shoulder as they looked out at the training ground. She enjoyed the way the harsh desert sun glittered off of the still waters of the lake, making the surface shine like it was composed of diamonds instead of water. Naruto's gaze was more transfixed on the beauty next to him, just eyeing her slightly damp hair and small smile. He loved it when Tayuya smiled. It was another reason he enjoyed their kisses so much. So, training. Tayuya burst out laughing at the absurdity of Naruto's remark, playfully slapping his shoulder as she chuckled. Right, training. Both Naruto and Tayuya were woken early in the morning, much to Tayuya's grumbling displeasure, by an Anbu operative. The weird thing was he told them they had been summoned by the Hokage. Naruto grinned widely when he realized that meant Gaara had taken the position. He hadn't come back last night and both of them were worried. At least now they knew that he had taken the position, which meant their words had helped. That even got Tayuya smiling. They hurried through the village. Friend or not, you weren't late when summoned by the Hokage. After a quick sprint they both appeared outside of his office, the receptionist only briefly glancing upward at them. They tentatively opened the door, not sure what they expected to find behind it. It was actually rather anticlimactic, just Gaara sitting at the desk looking over a small pile of paperwork that had accumulated since he accepted the position. Gaara. The redhead behind the desk just shook his head, confusing the two new entrees. Hello Naruto, Tayuya. They were slightly surprised when the voice came from their left and looked around to see another Gaara standing by a window, obviously having been looking out when they came in. The sand wielder just chuckled at their startled faces as they looked between him and the clone. What? You expect me to be around Naruto for 7 years and not pick up a few things? Naruto just smiled at Gaara using an A-rank jutsu just to do some paperwork while Gaara grimaced to himself. Although I have begun to realize why Naruto became so irritable after shadow clone training, that information influx is quite tiresome. Naruto just nodded, rubbing his head without even meaning to as he thought about it. He quickly perked up though. So you decided to take the job? Gaara nodded with a small smile, turning his neck to look out over the village again. Out of all of them, Gaara had been the most homesick during their stay in Konoha. So how does it feel to be called Kazekage-sama? Gaara's small smile turned into a fleeting frown as he turned back. Almost as tiring as this endless paperwork, I don't understand how the Hokage managed it without shadow clones. They all shared a laugh even though the actual answer was known to them. She drank. Naruto straightened up a bit when he remembered why they were here in the first place. So why did you summon us, Lord Kazekage? He said it jokingly, but it earned another frown from the young redhead. Please, don't call me that, it just doesn't sound right coming from you. Naruto chuckled but nodded anyway. So why did you call us here? Gaara smiled at Tayuya and walked over to the desk, letting the shadow clone disperse before he sat down in the chair. His eyes narrowed for a fleeting second before his body relaxed into the chair. The information he got in those sudden bursts was unpleasant, but endurable. Well, for one, I wanted to see my friends. That earned a small grin from them both, but more importantly, now that I'm Kazekage, I have certain privileges. The first thing I'm doing is putting you both on an A-rank mission. The two teenagers stared at their friend incredulously. Naruto actually put a finger in his ear and wiggled it to see if he was hearing right. An A-ranked mission. We just got back to the village. Gaara leaned forward on the desk and steepled his fingers together. Let me finish. I was thinking about our encounters with Itachi, Kisame, and Orochimaru, and it comes to my attention that none of us are powerful enough to fight against them and even have a hope of winning. A little bit of Naruto's ego deflated, but he saw Gaara's point. As Kazekage, even more information about Akatsuki has come to my attention and it has worried me. Every known member of the organization is a well-known S-class missing nin. Naruto narrowed his eyes. The information was shocking but expected based on what he had seen. That is why I am sending Naruto on a training trip to enhance his skills in preparation. He let the comment sink in for both of his friends before Naruto's brow furrowed. What do you mean sending? Where am I going? Tayuya also seemed to have questioned, but in an impressive show of patience she allowed Gaara to answer Naruto. That would be up to you. You must find places and people that are willing to train you. I have a few suggestions, but that can wait for later. He could see Naruto was still questioning him and he sighed. Naruto, it is best if you do not stay here in the village. There is no telling when Akatsuki will make their move, but our spy network places their best estimates at 2 to 3 years. You will have that time to travel the elemental nations and hone your skills. It is imperative that you improve so that Akatsuki can't use you for the goals. He leaned back in the chair, allowing Naruto to absorb the information as he turned to Tayuya. You said you were sending Naruto on a training trip. What about me? Gaara sighed and took a moment to think. This certainly wouldn't be easy. Tayuya, I am not sending you with Naruto because I have a different mission for you. Naruto looked up at this, listening more closely. I want you to infiltrate the Akatsuki. Silence reigned over the large office as both teenagers stared at their Kazekage in shock. What? Gaara flinched at the joint assault on his ears. Are you crazy, Gaara? Why would you ask Tayuya to do that? Tayuya had been about to angrily shout out essentially the same thing, but she turned to Naruto with a blank expression. What? You don't think I could do it? Naruto just stared at her in shock, wondering what the hell she meant by that. Of course not, Tayuya, but that would put you in danger. You would be close to the people who are trying to kidnap me and Gaara. Tayuya stared at him angrily and Naruto shrank in his chair slightly. So now I can't take care of myself, is that right? Naruto just looked at her with his mouth open, unable to speak from the shock. Tayuya's eye was twitching as she turned back around to Gaara. I'll do it. Gaara sighed again and spared a glance between her and Naruto. Tayuya, please don't be hasty about this. Naruto is right and you will be placing yourself in a great deal of danger. If you want to do this merely to prove Naruto wrong, then I will withdraw the assignment from you. Tayuya narrowed her eyes at him, but Gaara remained impassive, if slightly weary. I said I would take the mission. Gaara lowered his head a little but nodded all the same. Very well, I will give you more details on the mission later. In short, we have found a way into one of the Sasori of the Red Sand spy network. He is a current member. From there you can infiltrate the organization and find a way to actually breach Akatsuki itself. You too will have to train harder if you hope to actually become one. He leaned back and opened a drawer in his desk, withdrawing a folder with care and set it on the desk. You will approach them with this. It is the current defense strategy of the village as well as a few A-rank but not too dangerous jutsus from the Kazekage vault. Both teens stared at him a little strangely. It is an offering to gain the good graces. Don't worry about the defense plans, we will be updating them shortly anyway. They both nodded at this. It sounded like a good idea. Like I said, we can go over the finer details later. Tayuya nodded and leaned back in her own chair, suddenly having a lot to think about. Naruto, I mentioned earlier I had suggestions for your training trip. Naruto turned back to his friend turned Kage. The first place I would recommend you go to is Kumogakure. Why? Gaara frowned at being interrupted but carried on anyway. Firstly, I have a letter I would like you to deliver to the Raikage that I would rather not send by messenger hawk. I will be asking for an alliance between our nations. Both Tayuya and Naruto raised their eyebrows at what should have been top secret information. I am also asking him for advice on a few matters. As a new and young Kage, it would benefit me to hear the wisdom of others. Tsunade is a new Kage herself and the Mizukage is currently in the midst of a civil war. As for the Chuchikage, well, I don't believe he and Suna will have an alliance as long as we are allies of Konoha. Tayuya frowned from her seat. Kumo don't exactly like Konoha either. Gaara nodded with another sigh. I know, but to a lesser degree. Now that both Suna and Konoha have new leaders, I hope the Raikage can't see past his prejudices regarding Konoha. Anyway, back to the point, the second reason I would send you to Kumo, and perhaps most importantly, is the fact they currently have 2 Jinchuriki. I want you to warn them of the threat, along with any other of our kind you come across. Naruto nodded, he saw the importance of this as well. Perhaps more interestingly, the 2 are reported to have somehow gained full control of their Biju. If you can, learn how and possibly better use that knowledge for yourself. Again Naruto nodded, but this time with a smile. Getting control of Kyuubi's chakra faster would be a great help against Akatsuki and Orochimaru. Lastly, Kumo is well known for their lighting uses. You can finally train your other affinity properly. Naruto's smile grew into a grin. He had wanted to learn lightning jutsu for a long time, but they were more than scarce in Wind Country. Is there anything else? Gaara nodded while Naruto struggling to keep up with all of this information. Other things have come to my attention as Kazekage. I now have a list of the general location of all the Jinchuriki of the elemental nations. That stopped Naruto dead cold. 2 currently reside in Earth Country, 2 more in Lighting, 2 others in Water, and lastly there is 1 Jinchuriki reportedly living in Takagakure in the Land of Valleys. Naruto nodded along, not quite sure where Gaara was going with this. I would like you to try and find the Jinchuriki from Taki. They are more than likely alone, so I would like you to, in essence, check on them. If you deem it necessary, I want you to offer her sanctuary in Suna. However, know that Taki will not be happy if they find out you are doing so. Naruto nodded one last time, more solemnly than the rest, and Gaara finally leaned back in the chair, leaving the 2 to think about what he had said. Lastly, and this is more advice than an order, do not go to Earth Country. Naruto looked up from thought with a frown. Is it really that bad? Gaara just nodded. You experienced the prejudice of Iwanin firsthand with that old man. You bear far too much resemblance to the 4th Hokage for Earth Country to be safe for you. Naruto sighed in his chair. It really didn't feel fair that an entire country was essentially off limits for him just because he looked like somebody else. Yeah, you're probably right. Gaara nodded and looked over at Tayuya, who was still thinking. Don't worry about it too much, Tayuya. You won't be going on these missions until after my coronation. She nodded absently, and he took that to mean she had understood. Again, this is more a recommendation than anything else, but I urge both of you to not return to the village for at least 2 years. Both teens shot out of their chairs with the same anger that had started this whole conversation. 2 years. Once again Gaara had to wince from the combined shout. Yes, 2 years. For all we are aware, the Akatsuki is monitoring the village as we speak. If you come back, you will be in danger. This gives us enough time to plan out the next step. Gaara expected Naruto to be very opposed to this idea, but he just stood back, grinning eagerly. Then you know I'm coming back in exactly 2 years. Tayuya, on the other hand, didn't seem nearly as ecstatic. Gaara had just told her she wouldn't get to see him or Naruto, her boyfriend, for 2 whole years. So we need to find a way to stay in touch. Gaara nodded again as the two settled back into their chairs. Yes, we are currently working on that and have a few ideas for Tayuya. She looked up from thought, intrigued, but Gaara didn't continue. Like I said, we won't be doing this for a few days, so you have time to pack, prepare and say your goodbyes before you leave. Naruto looked like he wanted to say something more, but at that point the secretary popped her head around the door. Kazekage-sama, the council wishes to speak to you regarding your proposed change to the Shinobi Academy. Gaara nodded to her with a small smile before standing up from the desk with Tayuya and Naruto following suit. Thank you Naruto, Tayuya. We'll speak more about this back at the mansion. Until then I suggest you start preparing to leave. Both nodded with small frowns, both deep in thought about the next few years to come in slightly different ways. I'm going to become as strong as I can to protect Tayuya and Gaara, just you wait. I won't get to see Naruto for 2 years. Well, at least I'm going to be training as well. I'm not letting him overtake me. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.